On that rainy morning in New York, Emily Wright, a 32-year-old English literature professor, arrived at the university carrying a stack of Shakespeare and Austen books. Despite the gray skies, Emily radiated energy and enthusiasm, as always. Her students already knew that with her, class would never be boring. In the classroom, students gradually took their seats while Emily arranged her materials on the desk. She was about to start a discussion on romanticism and the impact of Emily Bronte's works when a student entered quietly through the door. He was new to the class. No one had seen him before. He sat in the last row, silently, his attentive eyes examining everything around him. "Good morning, class," Emily greeted, her tone always lively. "Today, we'll explore what drives someone to write about impossible loves and overwhelming passions. I hope everyone's ready to fall in love with literature." The new student, though quiet, did not go unnoticed. Tall, with messy brown hair and a serious look, he had an air that set him apart from the other young students. Emily noticed his discreet but intense interest. After her introduction, her eyes searched for him involuntarily, and when he noticed her gaze, he lowered his face, trying to hide a slight smile. After the introduction, she decided to engage the class. Let's start with a simple question. Why do you think writers like Emily Bronte dedicated so much of their work to love? Are we all, deep down, obsessed with the idea of finding something that lasts forever? The new student, who seemed lost in thought, surprised everyone when he raised his hand and replied with a firm voice. "Maybe, Professor, because the love we're afraid to lose is what defines us most. We write about it because we don't want it to become just a memory." Emily felt a shiver. He had captured the essence of romantic literature in a way she rarely saw among students that age. "Very well." She hesitated, not knowing his name. "It's James, Professor. James Connor." "Well, James, that's a fascinating perspective," Emily replied, genuinely impressed. "Let's explore that in more depth. Now, shall we analyze a passage from Wuthering Heights?" As the class progressed, Emily noticed that James was a brilliant student. He questioned, reflected, and debated with passion, standing out not only for his intelligence but for the depth of his insights. Throughout the lesson, Emily realized something unexpected, the intensity with which he looked at her. Gradually, the feeling she had when looking at James began to change. It was a strange connection, a silent bond that seemed to pulse between them. After class, while arranging her books, Emily saw James approach the desk. He was holding one of the Shakespeare copies she had used to explain concepts of tragic love. "Professor, this class was amazing," he said sincerely. "You really make us feel literature." Emily smiled, surprised by the honesty of his compliment. "I'm glad you enjoyed it, James. You really contributed a lot today." "I hope I can keep contributing," he murmured, keeping his gaze steady. Emily, not knowing exactly how to respond, just smiled back, trying to mask the slight discomfort that began to creep over her. Later, as she left the classroom, she found herself reflecting on what had just happened. "He's just a student. It's just a conversation about books," she repeated to herself, seeking logic. However, the connection between them seemed to deepen with each encounter, like an invisible thread binding them together, beyond her control. That night, at home, Emily couldn't get James out of her mind. She opened her computer, determined to review her students' assignments, but her mind kept returning to his words and looks. She felt absurdly guilty, as if she was breaking some moral code she hadn't even realized existed. She was an adult, a respected professor, and he was just a student. What was happening to her? The next day, when she arrived for class, she found a folded note on her desk. The firm, elegant handwriting left no doubt about who had written it. "Professor Emily, thank you for the book. I think I've never understood so much about myself as I have in those pages. Every dilemma of Raskolnikov resonates in a way that is almost frightening. I would like to talk more about it, if possible, after class. With admiration, James." Emily stood still, feeling a wave of emotions wash over her. It was just a conversation about a book, she repeated to herself, trying to calm her racing heart. During the class, she avoided James' gaze as much as possible, keeping her focus on the other students and her analysis of Hamlet. But deep down, she knew that both were eagerly awaiting the moment they would be alone. When everyone had left, James remained in his seat, leafing through the copy of Crime and Punishment. Emily took a deep breath, approached him, and sat beside him, maintaining a safe distance. "So, what did you think of the book so far?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though noticing her voice came out low, almost a whisper. James raised his eyes, holding the book as if it were a treasure. "I never thought I would identify so much with a story about guilt and redemption. It's as if, deep down, we all carry something we can't admit." James' gaze met Emily's, and in that moment, everything around seemed to disappear. She felt as if she could see what he was trying to hide, as if both were struggling against an invisible force. Emily broke the silence. "We all have something we hide, James. And sometimes, literature is just a way of dealing with it." He smiled, but his smile was melancholy. "That's why I enjoy being here so much, Professor. With you, I can understand what I myself can't express. It's as if, with you, things become clear." Those words hit her hard. Emily felt her heart race, her breathing heavier, and she knew that this was more than just admiration or friendship. It was something dangerous, something she couldn't control. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to collect herself. "James, you're an excellent student. But we need to keep things in their proper place," she said, with effort. He simply nodded, but the look they exchanged said more than any words. In the weeks that followed, James became one of the most engaged students in Emily's class. It was clear he immersed himself fully in the readings, especially in the denser works of writers like Shelley, Byron, and, of course, Emily Bronte. His presence began to be noticed not only by Emily but by the other students, who saw him as an intriguing figure, always distant yet intensely involved when it came to literature. Emily tried her best to ignore James's intense presence, staying focused on her professional duties. But whenever she posed a question to the class, she knew she could count on his insight. More than that, she began to anticipate his answers. There was something about how he interpreted texts, picking up on nuances and emotions that other students rarely grasped. By this time, Emily could no longer deny to herself that there was something in the air, a strange tension. One cold October afternoon, after an especially heated class discussion on Macbeth and its moral dilemmas, Emily saw James waiting for everyone to leave the room before approaching. "Professor, I wanted to ask for a reading recommendation," he began, his voice calm but with a hint of determination. "Something beyond the standard university lists. Do you have any suggestions?" Emily smiled, trying to keep the tone casual. "Of course, James. I think I can suggest something that may challenge your worldview." She went to her shelf and took out a worn book. "Have you read Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky?" James's eyes lit up, and he took the book reverently. "Never. But I've heard it's about inner conflicts. About guilt, if I'm not mistaken." "Exactly." Raskolnikov, the protagonist, is a complex character, torn between right and wrong. Maybe you'll see a bit of yourself in him. Many people do. He was silent for a few seconds, as if absorbing each word. Then he looked directly at her, with an intensity that made Emily look away for a moment. "Thank you, Professor. As much as I enjoy your classes, I feel it's in conversations like this that I truly learn. I believe you understand that better than anyone." Emily felt her cheeks flush. His proximity, his low and confident tone, made her question her own emotions. "He's just a student. It's just a conversation about books," she repeated to herself, seeking control. Yet, the connection between them seemed to deepen with each meeting, like a silent thread pulling them closer together. That night at home, Emily tried to distract herself with a stack of student assignments to grade, but her mind kept returning to James's words and gaze. She felt absurdly guilty, as though she were breaking a moral code she didn't even realize existed. She was an adult, a respected professor, and he was just a student. What was happening to her? The next day, when she arrived for class, she found a folded note on her desk. The firm, elegant handwriting left no doubt as to who had written it. Professor Emily, thank you for the book. I think I've never understood myself as much as I have in those pages. Every one of Raskolnikov's dilemmas resonates in a way that is almost frightening. I would like to talk more about it, if possible, after class. With admiration, James. Emily stood still, feeling a wave of emotion sweep over her. It's just a conversation about a book, she repeated to herself, trying to calm her racing heart. During the lesson, she avoided James's gaze as much as possible, focusing on the other students and on her analysis of Hamlet. But deep down, she knew that both of them were eagerly awaiting the moment when they would be alone. When everyone else had left, James stayed behind in his seat, flipping through the copy of Crime and Punishment. Emily took a deep breath, approached him, and sat down beside him, maintaining a safe distance. "So, what do you think of the book so far?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though noticing her voice came out soft, almost a whisper. James raised his eyes, holding the book as if it were a treasure. "I never thought I'd identify so much with a story about guilt and redemption. It's like, deep down, we all carry something we can't admit." James's gaze met Emily's, and in that moment, everything around them seemed to disappear. She felt as if she could see what he was trying to hide, as if they were both struggling against an invisible force. Emily broke the silence. "We all have something we hide, James. And sometimes, literature is just a way to deal with it." He smiled, but his smile was melancholic. "That's why I like being here so much, Professor. With you, I can understand things I can't express myself. It's as if, with you, things become clear." His words hit her hard. Emily felt her heart race, her breathing growing heavier, and she knew that this was more than admiration or friendship. It was something dangerous, something she couldn't control. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to regain composure. "James, you're an excellent student. But we need to keep things in their proper place," she said, with effort. He nodded, but the look they exchanged said more than any words. In the days that followed, Emily tried her best to keep her distance. She canceled her office hours outside of class, avoided meeting James's gaze during discussions, and left the classroom quickly after each lesson. However, the more she tried to pull away, the more she seemed to feel his presence. She sensed him watching her during each lesson, every discussion, and every lecture. James remained an exemplary student, but something between them had changed irrevocably, and they both knew it. One cold evening, after wrapping up an intense discussion on the moral dilemmas of Macbeth, Emily saw James waiting near the university entrance under a thin drizzle, seemingly expecting something, or someone. Without entirely knowing why, she quickened her pace towards him, trying to keep her posture firm, as if each step were a calculated and rational choice. When she approached, he looked up at her with a restrained smile, as though he had known she would come. "Professor Wright," he began without preamble, "I know you've been avoiding our meetings, and I understand your reasons, I think. But I didn't come here because of that." He paused, pulling his hood up to shield himself from the rain, which was starting to fall harder. "I feel like I'm no longer welcome in class lately. I keep wondering if I've done something wrong." Emily was taken by surprise. He noticed. But before she could respond, he continued, "You know, since I started attending your classes, everything's changed for me. The readings, the discussions. It's as if the world isn't so gray." He spoke in a low tone, almost as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. Emily's mind was spinning. Every word James said seemed designed to unsettle her, yet he sounded so genuine that it was impossible not to believe him. She knew she had to cut this off, to turn him away once and for all, But at the same time, it was difficult to resist what she felt. The attraction was undeniable, and the bond they shared seemed to grow stronger with every encounter. "James, maybe it's better if we take a break from conversations outside of class, as you mentioned, to keep the classroom environment more comfortable for everyone," Emily said, choosing each word carefully. He nodded, but his gaze was full of hurt. "I understand," he replied, his voice coming out colder. "But, just to be clear, this is the last thing I want." "I think you already know that." Emily's heart skipped a beat. It was a confession. She had known from that first glance that there was something intense between them. But hearing those words directly and knowing James shared the same feeling made everything even more complicated and dangerous. "James, this is complicated. You're my student, and there's a line we shouldn't cross," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't want to jeopardize you." He looked at her with a mixture of understanding and defiance. "So, are we condemned to pretend this doesn't exist?" His honesty disarmed her, and Emily felt that her control was slipping through her fingers, like sand. Emily looked away, feeling the weight of that question. "I don't know, James. All I know is that if we continue down this path, things could get very bad for both of us." Without another word, she turned and walked away quickly, feeling his gaze on her back as she disappeared into the university corridors. But despite all her efforts to contain herself, Emily's mind was in turmoil. The truth was she didn't know how much longer she could resist the growing feelings James stirred within her. That night, at home, Emily tried to distract herself with a pile of assignments to grade, but between every scribbled paragraph, images of James came to mind. His gaze, his words, the intensity. Near 10 o'clock, exhausted from fighting with herself, she left the grading aside and made herself a cup of tea, trying to calm her thoughts. However, as she picked up her phone, an impulse stronger than herself took over. She searched for James's name in her contacts list. She had saved his number in the first week to send class materials, but had never used it for anything personal. For a moment, his name illuminated the screen, and she stared at the number, her heart racing. "Don't do this," reason told her. But her fingers acted before she could reflect. The message was brief and direct. "I hope you understand my reasons." Her phone vibrated almost immediately. James's reply came quickly, as if he had been waiting for her message. "I understand, but that doesn't change what I feel." Emily felt a chill. She was opening a door with no way back, and she knew it. Before she could type a response, the phone vibrated again. "Do you want to talk about it?" She hesitated, her mind a mix of fear and desire. She knew that starting this conversation was risky, but something about finally putting their feelings into words was irresistible. She typed, her fingers trembling. "Maybe we can talk tomorrow after class." Somewhere discreet. After sending the message, she stared at the screen, waiting for his response. "I'll be waiting, Professor." The next morning, Emily arrived at the university with a heavy heart and turbulent thoughts. Every step down the hallway echoed with a weight she couldn't ignore, a constant reminder of the promise she had made to meet James that night. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't quiet the whirlwind of emotions or the fear of crossing a line she knew was irreversible. Class passed without issue, but the glances she exchanged with James were loaded with a tension they could no longer hide. Anyone paying close attention would have noticed a silent connection lingering between them like a shadow. After class ended, Emily quickly gathered her materials, taking a deep breath, fully aware that the moment was approaching. As she walked through the campus, her eyes searched for a secluded spot, away from the constant movement of students and faculty. She finally found a quiet corner behind one of the lesser-used buildings, surrounded by trees that rustled gently in the breeze. There, enveloped by the soft sound of leaves, she and James would have the privacy they needed. James arrived a few minutes later, his hands in his pockets, an expression both hopeful and cautious. His eyes were fixed on her with an intensity she hadn't seen before, and Emily fought the urge to look away. "Emily," he began, whispering her name as though testing the weight of it on his lips. That small break in formality made it clear that this conversation was no longer between professor and student. "James," she replied, struggling to keep control, I don't know how we got to this point." Her tone was a mixture of confusion and honesty. "We're here because we couldn't avoid it," he answered, taking a step closer to her. "From the moment I stepped into your class, something drew me to you. And it's not just admiration, and I think you know that." He stopped, waiting for her to say something, but Emily seemed frozen. She closed her eyes, trying to organize her thoughts. When she opened them, she looked at James with determination. "I shouldn't have let this happen. I shouldn't have let things go this far. You're a student, and my responsibility is to guide you, nothing more." James interrupted her, his voice urgent and steady. "You can say that, but you know it's more than that, Emily. I know you feel something for me, and I'm not wrong." He hesitated for a moment, and then, as if he couldn't hold back any longer, he gently grasped her arm. "Don't pretend this isn't real." The simple touch was like an electric shock for Emily. It ignited something inside her, something she had been trying to suppress since the beginning. This was not just attraction. It was a connection she knew was reckless but also undeniable. However, she needed to protect her career, her reputation, and, most of all, herself. "James, this can't happen," she said, her voice trembling. "I have too much to lose. And so do you." "Emily, I've never felt this way before," he confessed, his voice low and sincere. "I don't know how to explain it, but it's like you're the only person who understands me. Every word, every look, everything makes sense with you. I can't just pretend I feel nothing." His words hit her hard, igniting a storm of feelings that she tried desperately to suppress. She knew that if she surrendered to this desire, she'd be risking everything she had worked for. But what haunted her was that, despite all the logic, despite all the reasons to turn him away, the thought of losing him terrified her. "James, I can't. Please, understand that I can't." Her voice was weaker with every word, and she realized she was on the verge of tears. He took another step closer, so close now that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Emily, I'm scared too. But I also know that if we let this go, we'll spend the rest of our lives wondering what could have been." The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily felt herself split between desire and reason, between the life she knew and the overwhelming possibility before her. Finally, she took a deep breath and whispered, "James, I need time to think." "I'll wait, Emily," he said, giving her a sad smile. "I'll wait as long as you need." She turned away and left quickly, unable to look back, her heart in turmoil. James's image lingered in her mind all the way home, his silent promise echoing like a repressed scream. Emily knew she needed distance. The days that followed were a true test of Emily's resolve. She tried to fill every minute with commitments, meetings, and endless stacks of papers to grade, anything that would keep her mind off the tormenting thoughts of James. But despite all her efforts, his presence was constant, his gaze, his voice, his touch. She could feel him as if he were there with her, making her ache with both longing and guilt. That Friday evening, desperate for a distraction, Emily accepted an invitation from her colleagues for a happy hour. After a grueling week, she met two friends at a bustling bar in the heart of Manhattan. As they talked over trivial topics, Emily tried to keep herself present, but her mind kept drifting back to James. "You're acting strange tonight," remarked Rebecca, a history professor. "Is everything okay? You seem distracted." Emily forced a laugh, trying to hide her discomfort. "Oh, it's just been a long week. You know how it is," she answered vaguely. "Sometimes students give you more trouble outside the classroom than in it." Rebecca nodded, though her look was curious. "Speaking of students, have you noticed one of yours? Tall guy, always wearing that brown jacket? I think his name is James." Emily's heart skipped a beat, and she nearly spilled her drink at the casual mention of his name. "What about him?" she asked, trying to sound indifferent. "He has this intense look. You know, that type of student who seems to carry a story with him. Something he doesn't share with anyone," Rebecca continued, then shrugged. "Sometimes I wonder if students realize how much we can notice the things they try to hide." Emily forced a smile and nodded, trying to mask the effect this was having on her. "James is very bright. He has a unique perspective on literature," she said, unable to keep the affection from her tone. At the end of the evening, Emily felt even more conflicted than before. Rebecca's mention of James had been casual, but it confirmed what Emily felt. He was indeed different. And, even more unsettling, James saw her in a way no one else did. When she got home, Emily tried to mentally prepare herself for the following week, knowing she would see James again. She was determined to keep the boundaries she'd set, yet the sense of something incomplete gnawed at her. On Monday morning, when she entered the classroom, her heart beat with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. She knew she would see James and would need to act carefully to keep up appearances. However, as soon as she entered, she sensed a difference in the room. Students were talking in low, intense voices, and there was a buzz of excitement in the air. "Professor Wright, are you okay?" a student asked as Emily tried to understand what was going on. "Yes, I'm fine," she replied, attempting to sound normal. "Why?" The student hesitated. "Well, it seems there are some rumors going around about certain students and professors. Some people are saying they saw you with a student last night." Emily's blood ran cold, and a wave of panic washed over her. She tried to hide her shock, but her mind was already racing. Rumors? Hadn't they only been student gossip? They couldn't possibly be something serious, could they? Rumors? "About me," she tried to respond calmly, but her voice wavered slightly. The girl shrugged. "Probably just gossip, Professor. You know how people are. They always make things bigger than they really are. I just thought I'd let you know, in case you didn't hear about it." She smiled and walked away, leaving Emily alone, her heart racing. Throughout the class, Emily struggled to maintain composure, her mind flooded with panic. After all the caution, someone had started to suspect, someone had seen something. James's presence in the room only made things harder. Their eyes met several times, and he seemed to pick up on her discomfort, frowning with concern. When class ended, Emily waited until everyone else had left before calling James over discreetly. "James, someone might have seen us together last night," she said, her voice low and tense. He looked shocked, but determined. "So what, Emily? We were just having coffee. No one can prove anything more than that. You know it's not that simple," she whispered, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "These rumors, they're dangerous. They could ruin everything, for both of us." He took her hands firmly, but she quickly pulled away, looking nervously down the hallway. "We need to be more careful, James. I can't afford to lose everything. Please, promise me you'll be vigilant, that you'll try to keep a low profile." James looked at her with a mix of pain and understanding. "I promise, Emily. But you know I won't give up on you, even if they try to tear us apart. If it comes to that, I'll face anything for us." Emily felt the weight of his words, and she fought back the urge to embrace him. The love she felt for James was as powerful as the fear of the consequences they might face. She knew that, from then on, every step would be risky, but she also knew she could no longer fight her feelings. Emily and James now lived in their own world, each secret encounter strengthening the bond between them. Every moment shared in hidden places was charged with emotions they could barely contain. With each week, their meetings grew more frequent, more dangerous. Emily knew that they were walking a tightrope, that any misstep could expose their secret. And yet, the force of their connection was irresistible. One evening, after another meeting in a quiet cafe far from campus, James walked her to her car, parked on a dimly lit street. The city was blanketed in a soft mist, making the air colder and the streetlights hazy, creating an almost cinematic atmosphere. James hesitated as she prepared to enter the car, his eyes fixed on hers as if he had something he'd been wanting to say. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "I know you feel what I feel. Every time we're together, it's as if everything makes sense." Emily held the door handle, unable to look at him directly. He was right, and the feeling consumed her in ways she couldn't explain. There was something about James that made her feel alive, yet afraid, as if she were about to cross a boundary from which there'd be no return. "James, I don't know where this is going," she murmured, finally turning to face him. "We're heading towards something that could destroy everything we've worked for. You realize that, don't you?" James took a step toward her, his expression soft, almost vulnerable. "I know the risks, Emily, but I'd rather live this, even if it's brief, than never feel anything like this. I don't know what you feel, but for me, it's more than a passing impulse." She closed her eyes, allowing his words to resonate within her. She knew that surrendering to her feelings would risk everything she had built. But what haunted her was that, despite all her efforts to resist, the idea of losing what they shared frightened her. "James, we can't. Do you understand? I can't." Her voice trembled, and she realized that she was close to tears. He took one more step toward her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Emily, I'm scared too. But I know that if we let this go, we'll spend the rest of our lives wondering what could have been." The silence between them was heavy. Emily felt herself pulled between desire and reason, between the life she knew and the possibilities standing before her. Finally, she took a deep breath and whispered, "James, I need time to think." "I'll wait, Emily," he said, a sad smile spreading across his face. "I'll wait as long as you need." She quickly got into the car and, before leaving, looked back at him standing on the sidewalk, watching her with that bittersweet smile. On the way home, Emily replayed each second of that encounter, torn between euphoria and fear of what they might face. That night, she barely slept, tormented by a mix of guilt and joy. She knew she was risking everything she had worked for, but her feelings for James were stronger than her logic. No matter how much she feared the consequences, part of her ached to experience the full depth of that feeling, to let it consume her entirely. The next morning, when she arrived at the university, her heart raced with anxiety and anticipation. She knew she'd see James and would need to keep her distance, keep up appearances. Yet as soon as she entered the classroom, she sensed something different. The students' conversations were quieter but more intense, and there was an unusual tension in the air. "Professor Wright, is everything all right?" asked one student, her tone laced with concern as Emily took in the strange energy in the room. "Yes, everything's fine," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Why do you ask?" The student hesitated. "Well, some rumors have been going around, about certain students and teachers. People are saying someone saw you with a student last night." Emily's blood ran cold, a wave of panic seizing her. She masked her shock as best as she could, but her mind was racing. Rumors. She had thought they were only whispers between students, nothing real? Or were they? Rumors? "About me," she replied, striving for calm, but her voice trembled slightly. The girl shrugged. "Probably just gossip, Professor. You know how it is, people always exaggerate things. I just thought you should know, in case you hadn't heard." She gave a polite smile and walked away, leaving Emily alone with her heart pounding. The rest of the class passed in a blur. Emily struggled to keep her composure, her mind buzzing with fear. After everything, someone had started to suspect, someone had seen something. James's presence in the room made it even harder to focus. Their eyes met several times, and he noticed her discomfort, frowning with concern. When the lesson ended, Emily waited until everyone else had left before discreetly asking James to stay back. "James, someone may have seen us together last night," she said, her voice low and tense. He looked shocked, but his face quickly hardened with resolve. "So what, Emily? We were just having coffee. They can't prove anything beyond that." You know it's not that simple, she whispered, glancing around to make sure they were alone. These rumors, they're dangerous. They could ruin everything. For both of us. James held her hands tightly, but she quickly pulled away, looking nervously down the hallway. We need to be more careful, James. I can't afford to lose everything. Please, promise me you'll be careful, that you'll try to keep your distance. James looked at her with a mixture of hurt and understanding. I promise, Emily. But you know I won't give up on you, no matter what they say. I'll face anything for us, if that's what it takes. Emily felt the weight of his words, and she fought the urge to embrace him. Her love for James was as intense as her fear of the consequences they might face. She knew that, from now on, every step they took would be risky, but she also knew she was too deeply involved to turn back. The tension between Emily and James grew heavier with each passing week. The fear of rumors lingering only made their secret meetings more charged with anticipation and danger. Every glance, every brief encounter, seemed to deepen their connection. Emily knew that even the smallest mistake could bring everything crashing down, but the pull between them was unbreakable. That Wednesday, Emily asked James to meet her after class, in a discreet corner of campus. His face held a mix of anxiousness and determination, but he relaxed slightly when he saw her approach. However, Emily maintained a serious, troubled expression. They needed to talk about boundaries they had both ignored. James, we need to be realistic, she began, her voice low and firm. I know we told ourselves we could handle this, but I can't keep pretending everything's under control. This relationship, it's tearing me up inside. James's face tensed. Emily, I know it's complicated, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to stay together. We'll be more careful, avoid places where people know us. I just can't imagine my life without you. She looked away, struggling to find the right words. James, you're young, and you have a bright future ahead of you. And I need to be honest with you. I don't know how much further we can go without ruining everything. James was silent for a moment, absorbing her words, his expression a mixture of pain and frustration. Why do you think you're the only one with something to lose? That's not true. Since I met you, everything I do, everything I feel, is about us. Don't ask me to let go of something that means so much to me. Emily sighed, but before she could respond, footsteps in the hallway alerted her. She instinctively adjusted her posture, trying to appear casual. As the source of the noise came into view, Emily's stomach dropped. It was Professor Harris, the head of the literature department. He looked at her with a slight frown, then shifted his gaze to James, who kept a respectful distance. Emily, Harris said, his tone polite but edged with curiosity. I hope everything's all right. His gaze lingered briefly on James before returning to her. Yes, everything's under control, Emily replied with a tense smile, trying to suppress the anxiety his presence caused. I was just clarifying a few points about James's last paper, nothing more. Harris seemed to consider her response, scrutinizing each word. I see, he said at last. Well, keep an eye out, Emily. I know how charming young students can be, and sometimes challenging to manage. The friendliness in his tone carried an undertone of concern that hinted at something deeper. Emily stood silent, her smile frozen, feeling exposed under Harris's gaze as he left. Once he was out of sight, she let out a deep sigh, the impact of the encounter washing over her. This is exactly what I'm trying to avoid, James, she whispered, her voice tight with urgency. You heard what he said. It's only a matter of time before someone finds out, before things get out of control. James, however, remained steady. Emily, stop worrying about what others think. They don't understand what we have, what this means for us. His frustration was clear, but there was also a note of pleading in his voice. I just need a chance to prove this is worth it. His words made her hesitate. Emily knew she was already too involved to walk away without suffering the consequences. Every stolen moment, every glance or touch, only strengthened her love for James. In an impulsive decision, knowing she might regret it later, she realized they needed more than stolen glances and hurried whispers. They deserved a real moment together, away from the judgmental eyes at the university. Quickly, she made a plan. "James," she began, her voice hesitant but determined, I need some time to think. And maybe, if you're willing, we could leave the city this weekend. Just for one day. We need space. We need to understand what we're doing before everything spirals out of control." A hopeful smile broke across his face, his eyes lighting up. "All I need is a chance to be with you, Emily. Like I've always imagined." They agreed on a time and place. She would pick him up at a discreet spot far from the university to avoid suspicion, and they'd spend the day in a small town where they could just be Emily and James, without the labels of professor and student. The rest of the week was a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Each night, Emily questioned the decision she had made. The consequences were impossible to predict, and she knew this meeting could mark the beginning of an irreversible path. Yet, driven by a yearning she couldn't deny, she was ready to risk it all to experience the depth of her feelings. When Saturday arrived, Emily drove to the agreed location with trembling hands. Her heart pounded as she saw James waiting in the distance. He looked different, more relaxed, and as she approached, he smiled with an expression that melted away all her fears. "Ready for our escape?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Ready to be with you, Emily," he replied without hesitation. During the drive, they talked about everything and nothing. It was the first time they felt truly free, and each word exchanged seemed to bring them closer. They arrived in a quiet little town, chose a small, secluded restaurant, and spent hours talking and laughing as if they were the only two people in the world. As the sun began to set, they took a walk along a trail near a lake. The sky was painted in shades of orange and red, and a gentle silence settled over them. Feeling a rare sense of peace, Emily held James's hand, pulling him down beside her on the grass. There, beneath the twilight sky, they lay together in silence, simply enjoying each other's presence. "Emily," he whispered, looking into her eyes, "I don't want this to end. Even if the whole world is against us, I don't care. I just need you to know that." She gently touched his face, her heart swelling with conflicting emotions. "James, I don't know what the future holds, but I know this: what I feel for you is real. It's the only certainty I have." They stayed there until the night fully set in, knowing that this moment was fleeting but willing to hold on to it for as long as they could. The world outside felt distant, irrelevant, and they both silently promised to keep fighting for what they had, no matter the cost. The next morning, as the first light of dawn broke over the small town, Emily and James were already preparing to return to reality. Their day together had felt like an impossible dream, a memory they both feared would fade once they returned to the city. But now, with the car gliding down the highway back to New York, the weight of the real world began to press upon Emily's shoulders. The silence between them was thick, filled with words they didn't dare speak. Emily kept her focus on the road, but her mind was adrift. She knew that as soon as they reached the city, the dangers and responsibilities they'd temporarily escaped would come crashing back. She was already thinking about the consequences and what they'd risked just to share a few stolen hours together. As they neared the drop-off point, a quiet street a few blocks from campus, Emily pulled the car to a stop. They sat in silence for a moment. James turned to her, his eyes full of intensity. "Emily, this weekend was the best of my life," he said, taking her hand. "I know this is risky, but what we feel is real. No matter what people say, I want to face everything alongside you." Emily looked at him, feeling the warmth of his hand like an anchor. "James, I feel it too, but we need to be careful," she whispered, swallowing hard. "People are already watching us. I can't let you risk your future for this." James looked away, frustrated. But what's the point of a future if I have to pretend none of this happened? That I never met you. His words cut deep. Emily knew they were on a path that could lead to their undoing, but she couldn't ignore the aching need to be with him. I don't know what comes next, she said, her voice shaky. Just promise me you'll be careful. We can't take any more risks. He nodded, his face clouded with pain. After a quick, lingering kiss, James stepped out of the car and walked away, disappearing down the street. Emily watched him go, feeling a hollow ache in her chest that quickly filled with fear for what lay ahead. When she arrived at the university the next day, Emily tried her best to appear calm. She headed toward the office of Professor Harris, the department head, to handle some paperwork. But as soon as she stepped in, she noticed a change in his demeanor. He looked at her with a stern expression. Emily, could we speak for a moment? Harris gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat down, her nerves on edge, hands clenched in her lap as she faced him. I know you're a dedicated teacher, Emily, but some rumors have reached me, he began, his gaze sharp. I thought about dismissing it, but the situation seems to be developing beyond idle chatter. Emily felt her stomach drop. Rumors. What she'd dismissed as student gossip had evidently reached her superiors. Professor Harris, I don't know what you're referring to, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. He gave her a penetrating look. Emily, we're colleagues, and I wouldn't bring this up if it weren't serious. But people are talking, and some students say they've seen you with a particular student in unconventional situations off campus. Emily felt her face grow hot as she registered his implication. Harris's stern expression left no doubt about the gravity of what he suspected. These students are just imagining things, Professor Harris, she replied, trying to sound confident. There's nothing inappropriate going on. Harris nodded slowly, but his expression was skeptical. I trust you, Emily. But if these rumors persist, I may not be able to ignore them. I have to protect this institution's reputation. I suggest you avoid any situations that might raise suspicion. Emily left Harris's office feeling her legs weaken, as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff. His warning was clear. She was being watched, and the slightest misstep could end her career. From that moment on, Emily avoided any place where she might encounter James. She knew the distance would hurt him, but her fear of losing everything was now too overpowering to ignore. Every time she thought of what they shared, she recalled Harris's hard gaze and the thinly veiled threat of consequences. But despite all that, the ache of missing James was like a weight pressing on her heart. One afternoon, while sorting through her students' assignments in her office, her phone lit up with a message from James. Emily, I miss you. I don't understand why you're pushing me away, but I can't keep going like this. Can we talk? I can't just let this end without knowing how you feel. Emily's eyes filled with tears. She knew that seeing him again would weaken her resolve, but she also knew that their relationship couldn't continue like this. Trying to stay calm, she typed out a reply. James, I miss you too. But we're in a difficult situation. I don't know what to do. I just need some time to think. His response came almost instantly, his intensity clear even in his words. I'll wait, Emily. I'll wait as long as you need. But please, don't leave me in the dark about what you feel. Emily held the phone, struggling to contain her emotions, but she knew she couldn't keep this up much longer. If people were already suspicious, it might only be a matter of time before things spiraled beyond her control. That night, she sat alone in her apartment, lost in memories of every moment she'd shared with James, every smile, every touch, every promise. But now, the harsh reality forced her to confront the risks, and she knew that perhaps there was no way to protect both their futures and the love they shared. Emily hadn't seen James in weeks. Even in class, he disappeared completely, transferring to another section without any explanation. She found out through a colleague who mentioned the switch casually. The announcement, delivered so bluntly, left a hollow ache in her chest, an emptiness that no rational explanation could fill. The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. She tried to move forward, putting up a professional front, but she felt like she was living as a shadow of herself. Her heart, once filled with anxious excitement, was now numb, hardened by the reality that she'd lost something irreplaceable. Then, one rainy night, several weeks after their final goodbye, Emily found an envelope slipped under her door with no return address. She recognized James's handwriting instantly and opened it, her hands trembling. "Emily, I wasn't planning on writing to you, but I need words to close everything I lived and felt with you. Being with you was like discovering a part of myself I didn't know existed, a part only you were able to awaken. I know we made the right decision, but it still hurts, a pain that won't go away. No matter how hard I try to move forward, I still carry every look, every word, every smile we shared. You'll always be the most beautiful and painful memory of my life. If we ever meet again, know that I loved you with everything I had, and no farewell could ever erase that. With all my love, James." Emily couldn't stop the tears from falling. With each word, she felt the weight of love and loss bearing down on her. The letter was a goodbye, yet also a reminder that, despite the end, what they'd shared could never be erased. She sat on the floor, clutching the letter to her chest, allowing herself to fully feel the impact of all they had been. It was the last tangible reminder of their love, something she knew she would never experience again. In the months that followed, Emily began to rebuild her life slowly. But James's memory remained, a love left unfinished that she carried within her, an absence that lingered wherever she went. Occasionally, she would pass by places they'd been together, and for a moment she could feel his presence beside her, a silent shadow that walked with her. She knew that wherever James was, he carried the same absence. Years later, on a spring afternoon, Emily received unexpected news. A fellow professor mentioned that James had published his first book, a blend of poetry and prose about lost loves and impossible connections. The book was about a forbidden love between two people separated by the world's conventions, but who, despite the distance, remained connected. Curious and overwhelmed with emotion, Emily bought the book and devoured its pages. Every line felt like pieces of herself, fragments of everything they'd experienced. James had turned their love into words, immortalizing what the world had forced them to end. In the dedication, she found what she'd both feared and longed to see. "For E, who was and will always be the love of my life." Emily closed the book, holding it to her chest as tears filled her eyes, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and grief. The love they'd shared, brief as it had been, would never disappear. She knew that as long as there were words to tell their story, he would always be with her. Emily sat in her small, warmly lit apartment, still clutching James's book against her chest, lost in a whirlwind of emotions. The words she had just read filled her with a deep sense of bittersweet fulfillment. She knew that she would never forget James, and now his words would live with her forever, an echo of the love they had shared. As the days passed, she felt a strange sense of peace settling over her, even though a part of her would always ache with the memory of him. Life moved on, but she carried James with her in her heart, a quiet yet persistent presence that she had finally come to accept. A few months later, Emily received an invitation to attend a book signing event for local authors. She almost declined, not wanting to risk running into anyone who might have seen her with James or heard the rumors from years before. But curiosity got the best of her. She wanted to see if she could finally say goodbye to him, even if just by attending this event in silence. The bookstore was crowded, full of bustling attendees. Emily scanned the room, feeling her heart skip a beat when she saw James standing at a table near the back, signing copies of his book. He looked older, more mature, with the kind of wisdom one gains only through loss and reflection. Her breath caught in her throat, but she kept her distance, lingering near the entrance, hidden from his view. She watched him quietly, noting the warmth he shared with each reader, his smile a little sad but genuine. She could see that he'd grown into himself, become the person he was meant to be. In that moment, she felt a swell of pride and something like closure. Finally, just as she turned to leave, she felt someone approach her. "Emily." The voice was unmistakable. She turned to find James standing there, holding a copy of his book. For a moment, neither of them spoke, as though caught between the past and the present. He looked at her with the same intensity she remembered, his gaze soft but unwavering. "I didn't think you would come," he said, his voice warm and steady. "I didn't think I would either," she replied, her heart beating rapidly. "But I wanted to see what you created." He held out the book, handing it to her with a gentle smile. "It's yours if you want it." Emily took the book, glancing down at the cover, feeling the weight of all that had passed between them. "Thank you, James, for everything. For keeping us alive in your words." James looked at her, and she could see the same love and longing in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. "You were my muse, Emily. You still are. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." Emily smiled through tears, feeling an ache but also a release she hadn't expected. "And I wouldn't be the person I am without you. I'll carry you with me always." They stood there for a moment, two people forever bound by the love they had shared, yet now walking separate paths. Slowly, Emily reached out and touched his hand, a final goodbye, one that was filled with gratitude and the acceptance of everything they had been to each other. As she walked away, she felt lighter, her heart full of both sorrow and joy. She knew that their story would never truly end. It would live on in her heart and his words, echoing in the spaces between her past and her present. In the quiet solitude of her life, she would hold him forever, a memory preserved in words and the unbreakable bond they had created. And with that, Emily finally found peace, carrying James with her always, a love that would never fade, a story that would never be forgotten.